Did you everybody got their makeup on? No, I'm just kidding.
Right side.
Thank you for participating in today's hearing on blood-related injuries from COVID-19 vaccination. I want to especially thank our witnesses today, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Ryan Cole, and Dr. Kirk Milhoan, for making the time in their busy lives to be here with us today. Thank you very much, gentlemen. The vaccine adverse events reporting system has seen a massive spike in reports following the rollout of the COVID vaccines. So many people have been affected, yet politicians here in Washington are too afraid to do anything about it.
I'm Dr. Ryan Cole. I'm a board-certified anatomic and clinical pathologist trained at the Mayo Clinic. I've been in practice for over 20 years and ran an independent medical laboratory for 2 decades, and ended up having to sell that because I spoke out against this COVID narrative and got canceled by insurance companies for, quote, unprofessional behavior for telling the truth. So it's an honor to be here today. Do you want me to do an opening statement as well, or just introduction?
Of course, an opening statement.
Okay, opening statement. So, we're at an unprecedented time in American history. And it used to be that we were a nation of the people, for the people, by the people. And now we're of the corporation, for the corporation, and by the corporation. Countless Americans have been harmed because people have believed biased media. People have believed corrupt pharmaceutical narratives. Countless people in this nation are hurting and being ignored. Now, I'm a pathologist. The pathologist is the most important doctor that you never meet, that you always hope is right. So we see a part of people every day. We see your blood. We see your microbiology. We see your tissues under the microscope. And the cells don't lie. And what we've found in this unfortunate 4 years is we've been ignored. We see the damage. And later in the hearing, I have some slides that if we have time, I'll share, because the picture's worth 1,000 words. But we see what's happening to the people. And I'm tired of the American people being gaslit and being told, well, it's anything and everything, but it's not the, quote, vaccine. This is a gene transfection product that billions of people have received, and genetic products need to be monitored for a long period of time. We have countless people injured that are being ignored, and we can't do this anymore. And, I'm not here to judge people if you got 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shots, whatever. I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying don't get another one. This is an unproven, unsafe product. We need to acknowledge that there's injury happening around the world, and we need to stop these products immediately, not just the COVID shots. Any mRNA platform going forward is unproven and unsafe. And this is about an oath that all of us took. We took an oath to first do no harm, primum non nocere. We take that oath seriously. Most of us sitting here have given up almost everything. So we're grateful to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to ask questions or answer any questions you may ask going forward.
I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm a practicing internist and cardiologist in Dallas, Texas. I'm trained in public health and have a master's degree in public health and epidemiology. I'm very experienced in academic medicine. I have over 780 peer-reviewed publications cited in the National Library of Medicine. I have over 70 papers on the COVID-19 pandemic, both on many aspects of the pandemic, including early treatment, and now vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths. I have been on data safety monitoring boards and interacted with the FDA and big pharma and device companies. I've interacted with the European medicine agencies as well as the MHRA in the past, lectured at virtually every medical school in the United States. I'm well known to all of them. We're 4 years into this, and this is the first time that the U.S. House of Representatives has heard from doctors who are directly treating patients with both COVID-19 and the vaccine injuries. That's 4 years too late. I think that's a very important lesson learned. I never supported these vaccines. I never told a single patient that it was safe to take a vaccine. I didn't take a COVID-19 vaccine myself because it wasn't safe. And I published an op-ed in The Hill in August of 2020, before they came out. The title of that op-ed is The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Pandemic. The reason why it was a gamble is because the vaccines, and of Americans who took the vaccine, is roughly 75% of Americans took at least one shot, according to the COVID states program. Of those, 94% took a messenger RNA vaccines. So we can restrict our comments to messenger RNA vaccines provided by Pfizer and Moderna. These vaccines are a brand new technology that installs the genetic code for the lethal part of the virus, which is the spike protein, the spine on the surface of the virus. This was an extraordinary gamble because there was no knowledge of what was going to turn this off. Once the genetic code gets in the body, there was no knowledge of, does the body get rid of the genetic code? What shuts it off? Will some people produce too much genetic code and have it keep moving from cell to cell and too much spike protein? It was known then that the spike protein was lethal. And to give a genetic code for a potentially lethal protein that was devised in a Chinese biosecurity lab to Americans was the most dangerous proposition our government agencies could have ever put forward to our country. And what we've learned on this is extraordinary. Castriuta and colleagues has published the messenger RNA is physically circulating in the blood for at least 28 days. That's as long as they've looked. Crossan and colleagues from Harvard has shown the messenger RNA is stuck in the human heart 30 days after the vaccine when people die. And there's inflammation around it, presumably due to the spike protein. Rolkin and colleagues from Stanford have shown the messenger RNA is stuck in human lymph nodes for at least 2 months. And that's as long as they've looked. Now, the spike protein, which is produced by the messenger RNA, is widely circulatory in blood and shown by Harvard, by Ogata and colleagues, Swank, and recently Brogna in Germany. Now, Brogna in Germany looked 6 months afterwards, and at least half the people who took the shots had vaccine spike protein circulating in their bloodstream. That's as long as they've looked. And they can identify it because Pfizer and Moderna have an amino acid signature on their spike protein to let us identify. We know that it's Pfizer and Moderna. It doesn't come from the natural virus. It's coming from the vaccine. That's proven.
My name is Kirk Milhoan. I am board certified in pediatrics and pediatric cardiology. Before my medical degree, I got a PhD in cardiovascular physiology and pharmacology. My thesis was on what causes inflammation in the heart. It just so happens the pathway I was studying is the exact pathway that COVID, the spike protein, causes inflammation within our body. I wanted to share what my heart is that I bring to this hearing as a physician and a scientist. And it goes back to two basic historic ancient texts. Dr. Ryan Cole already alluded to the Hippocratic Oath, which says, do no harm. So as physicians, we are called, we have taken an oath to do no harm. The second, and I consider this as I share my thoughts and my education and my experiences, comes from the Bible. And it says, the goal of my instruction is love, from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. We have, when I share what I'm seeing in my patients and throughout the literature, I share from a place of compassion, not of judgment. When we see these patients, regardless of how they've been injured, we need to bring the loving and compassionate care to bear on these people who have been injured, and we have to find a way to treat them. We can't just let them. There are too many of them, as Dr. McCullough so clearly put out. And I wanted, as he said at the end, at what Rasmussen was seeing, I wanted to share, because sometimes it's interesting to when we're facing sometimes the non-science, when we're facing something, the non-scientists often show us and they look at data a little bit differently. And a lot of times that comes from the the insurance company, because the insurance company is basing their entire livelihood on well people not getting sick and knowing what percentage of well people should get sick. So Ed Dowd is one of those financial guys, and he's been looking at the insurance data. His research team recently evaluated the data out of UK. And it was from the United Kingdom death and disability trends for cardiovascular diseases in 15 to 44-year-olds, What's important about that statement is you shouldn't have cardiovascular disease in 15 to 44-year-olds. So if this is now a spike, this is something we really have to look at. So they found very concerning data, and I quote, "We show a large increase in the morbidity and mortality due to disease of the cardiovascular system from 2021. The increase in disability claims is consistent with the increase in excess deaths, and both are highly significant. The data show a 13% increase in excess cardiovascular death in 2020, then a 30% increase in 2021, and a 44% increase in 2022. Something significantly has increased excess cardiovascular deaths in 2021, and it continues. As humans, physicians, and scientists, we should be curious with what has happened." There's really only one major thing that happened in 2021, and that was the rollout of this untested vaccine.
What is the difference between the old vaccines we've grown up with that we know and trust versus the mRNA vaccine that's now the COVID vaccine, but could be made into more vaccines? Could you explain that a little bit?
The existing vaccines, now they have grown in number and intensity over time. And the mothers know this on the childhood schedule. It's called the ACIP schedule. ACIP is a committee charged by the CDC to recommend what American children should receive. These conventional vaccines are either proteins, such as the tetanus toxoid or the pneumococcal protein, hepatitis B protein. And they're simply proteins that the body responds to. The proteins themselves can't cause disease. You can't get tetanus from a tetanus shot. Or they are killed viruses. So for instance, influenza is a killed virus. You get a flu shot. You can't get flu from a flu shot because the virus is killed, but people get flu-like syndrome and they get confused with this, but it's a killed virus. Or it's a live attenuated virus. That is, the virus is alive, but it's crippled and it can't cause serious disease. And an example there would be the shingles vaccine or the chickenpox vaccine. So these vaccines are not perfect, but they do provide a basis of which we try to ensure some health of our pediatric population. Messenger RNA is drastically different. Messenger RNA is the genetic code for part of a virus. And when it installs in the human body, it hijacks the body's machinery to read the genetic code called ribosomes. And then they produce an uncontrolled amount of a protein, in this case, the spike protein, for an uncontrolled duration of time. So this is very different than a tetanus shot. Tetanus shot is a specific amount of tetanus toxoid, period. The body digests this and goes away. This is genetic code that produces the spike protein, it looks like, potentially indefinitely. The human body, to our knowledge, has no way of breaking down the messenger RNA and has no way of breaking down the spike protein. There are no described enzymatic pathways for the human body to dispose of this. In my view, the COVID-19 vaccine program has complicated this because people have taken unprecedented numbers of shots. If one was to follow the US government program right now, taking a shot every 6 months with the primary series, they'd be approaching 10 shots. This is unprecedented to give 10 sets of inoculations.
What does the spike protein do inside the body? If our bodies can't break it down, what is the spike protein doing?
It's found circulating in blood. Recent paper by former NIH researcher David Scheim suggests, based on all the data, that 40% of it is actually linked to red blood cells. So it's actually causing clumping of red blood cells. And we see micro clumps of red blood cells now in multiple studies. It's inside white blood cells. Bruce Patterson at IncellDX has shown that it's inside CDC16 monocytes. And Dr. Cole will share with us later on, the spike protein is penetrating all the tissues in the body. So it's actually in tissue layers in the body. And it appears to be accumulating.
And it doesn't go away.
It's unknown. It's unknown. In the Brogna paper of interest, people who took Pfizer and Moderna, 50% of people who take the shots have detectable circulating spike protein. 50% don't. And in a paper by Schmeling and colleagues from Denmark, of interest, 30% of people who took the shots have no side effects whatsoever. None, not even a sore arm. It looks like they don't develop side effects. Another, just under 2/3, have some modest side effects. And then in the Schmeling study, it was 4.2% of people who really get severe side effects. In our CDC vSafe data, which over 10 million Americans volunteered in the data set, 7.7% of people really get sick and have to go to the emergency room or be hospitalized. So what we've learned is the vaccines have been broadly applied. Thank goodness most people are okay. But there is a small but significant number of people who really get in trouble with the vaccines. Multiply that times a big number of people who took the shots. That's the reason why we got a health crisis.
There's been reports with embalmers talking about blood clots. And this has been labeled a conspiracy theory. Is this a conspiracy theory? What are you seeing as a pathologist when you're looking at tissue and you're looking at blood? In your experience, what have you seen?
Well, it's a scientific fact. It's not a conspiracy theory. And again, I have some images I can show later, but we saw during COVID increased clotting markers in patients that were sick with COVID. As Dr. McCullough mentioned, the lethal toxic part of this virus, the spike protein, has a propensity to cause blood to clump. These embalmers, I have many of these samples in my laboratory that we've looked at. These are unusual clots. And Dr. Pretorius out of South Africa, Dr. Kell out of the UK, Dr. Jordan Vaughn in Alabama have researched this, and the blood is forming a unique folding protein called amyloid. And these clots are almost like a rubber band or a rubber ball. And in pathology, you know, we use food descriptors for different things. A normal clot is kind of jelly-like in terms of consistency. These are very firm. Another important thing to piggyback on what Dr. McCullough said is compared to traditional vaccines, those you get in the arm, obviously there can be side effects from some of the chemical adjuvants. These shots, the gene is wrapped in a little fat bubble, a lipid nanoparticle. Now, if you look at the manufacturer's list of ingredients, all of these are not approved for human nor veterinary use, and yet went into billions of arms. This fat bubble can go anywhere and everywhere in the body instead of staying in the arm. So this gene wrapped in a fat bubble can land anywhere or everywhere. And that's why we're seeing the side effects in the vaccine injured that we don't traditionally see with typical vaccines. Lipid nanoparticles were designed to carry chemotherapeutic agents to the brain. So these were designed to go everywhere. And so the first place they go is circulation. And then they will, that little, like a magnet, a positive, negative charge, that fat bubble will attach to a cell, the gene will go in. Human cells are meant to make human proteins. Human cells are not meant to make foreign proteins. And when our cells start making foreign proteins, our immune system goes on high alert and says, attack, attack. And so our own immune system, our killer cells, our natural killer cells, will go in and say, this is an enemy, start destroying those cells. So we see liver damage, we see adrenal gland damage, we see brain damage, we see heart damage, we see damage of the blood vessels. So these clots are because an inflammatory response is happening in the lining of the blood vessels first and foremost. And then as the immune system reacts, there's this little waterfall cascade of this protein and this protein and this protein and this protein. I won't get into all the clotting factors. But because of this response, these clots form. And as Dr. McCullough mentioned, clinically, he's seeing in patients clots that we have not seen historically.
The problem with when they start making a synthetic mRNA, once again, your body will break down regular, true RNA right away. But what they're putting in the platform isn't broken down quickly. And so if it incorporates, and this is, I think, what we're seeing in some people, is they are now become a spike protein factory that doesn't stop. And we're not sure we have a way to stop it.
And gratefully, like Dr. McCullough pointed out, it's not everybody, but it's enough people that they should not be ignored.
So is it fair to say then that these vaccine manufacturers created these vaccines with the synthetic mRNA that has created diseases, heart disease, strokes, neurological problems, everything that you've talked about. Do these same vaccine manufacturers sell the cures for the diseases that they're creating? Is that a fair thing to say? Do they sell other drugs that say treat strokes or cardiovascular disease and so forth? Is that true?
I find it ironic that Pfizer just spent $40 billion on a cancer treatment company. So I don't know. I'm not in their boardrooms.
I'm not accusing them of
I'm not in their
causing
boardrooms,
it,
but it's curious.
It's a
yes.
fair comment that I can tell you in my clinical practice as an internist and cardiologist, I've never prescribed so many blood thinners in my career. Never.
And what I do want to quick point out is we have 3 doctors in front of us that all had the courage and compassion to actually treat COVID patients. You know, think back in the early days of COVID, we had no idea how deadly it was. And so it took real courage to be a nurse or a doctor on the front lines and do that. And so we have 3 doctors who did that. Dr. McCullough, do you remember Dr. Jha? He was the Democrat witness in our November 19th, 2020 hearing on early treatment, who, when I asked the question, have you ever treated a COVID patient? He said no, kind of a mic drop moment. We found out later he never left his apartment until a couple months after the vaccine came out. That's how afraid he was. He is or was the COVID czar for the Biden administration. I mean, obviously we've got eminently qualified doctors. I know how you've been vilified, how they've tried to marginalize you, but anybody who's listening to this panel realize these are highly qualified, compassionate doctors. What is happening throughout our medical establishment?
I guess the honest thing to say is I have no idea. We have jumped the rails. We're used to I sort of, as a pediatrician, when I would give, I was comfortable with treatments if I thought they were effective, with about a 1 in a million for vaccines. A 1 in a million chance of getting it, what you were trying to prevent, a 1 in a million of death. I felt comfortable with that. So when you have something, and we knew very early, the signal was early. It wasn't late for the COVID vaccines. They were very early. Probably within a month, we met criteria that previous vaccines had been taken off the market, whether it was Rotoshield or whether it was swine flu and many others. There are a whole bunch of times we make mistakes in medicine. What the country counted on is that not only the doctors would speak up, but then the regulatory bodies would say, okay, you're right, that met signal, we got to pull it off. I don't know what's going on, because when I look at the Cleveland Clinic data, when there were 51,000 employees that are looked at, and they study and they say, what's your risk of getting COVID? And it looks at how many vaccines you had. The lowest risk for getting COVID is if you've had 0 vaccines. As you add vaccines, your risk to get COVID goes up. I've never seen a vaccine like this. That's not the basis of vaccines. They shouldn't have what we would call negative efficacy. That is a peer-reviewed, beautiful study from Cleveland Clinic, completely ignored. I think that a lot of times, some of our colleagues, what I hear from most of my colleagues, Kirk, you're right, but I'm not going to stick my head out. I'm going to work 1 or 2 more years, and then I'm retiring.
I want to piggyback on Dr. Milhoan's excellent comment. Fear. The simple answer is fear. The body of the profession of medicine is almost all employed now. The number of people that have spoken out have mostly been independent, and those who weren't independent did pay that price, lost their jobs for speaking truth. And are our colleagues awake? Are people getting these boosters? No, they're not, because the people are awake. They're still pretty quiet as well. There's obviously a vocal 30% of Americans that are speaking out. We have a booster for something that's extinct, and it's still being pushed by our government agencies.
Explain to those who are just, bumpkins like myself, how we got to this point and how we extract ourselves so we don't ever get there again. Can you?
Well, I always like to joke, what is an elephant? An elephant is a mouse built to government standards. So if we go back historically and look, unfortunately, at a lot of laws that have been passed over time, it builds up this machine that's almost unstoppable. So you look at the PrEP Act. The PrEP Act has some horrific parts of it. Look at what was it, the Bayh-Dole Act that allowed universities to make gajillions of dollars off their patents. So we go back and does the government work for the people, or does the government work for industry? And so that's the big question. And there's so much lobby money. Yes, the FDA is captured by pharmaceutical companies in terms of how much money, what percentage of their budget they get from pharma for drug approval and fast tracking. If you look at the CDC Foundation, they make billions of dollars off vaccine patents. They hold the patents to 56, 58 vaccines now. If you look at the NIH officials, if they have a patent on a drug that goes to market, they can make $150,000 a year for the rest of their life if they, like several of the individuals at NIH that are on the Moderna patent under Tony Fauci. So there are intertwining corrupted interests, financial interests certainly. And when we as a nation value money over our freedom, and when we value our own self-interest over having a constitution that matters to each and every one of us and a Bill of Rights that we actually believe in and stand for, again, then we're on the wrong track. So I think it started with bad legislation over time that we can roll back, hopefully. I also think to Dr. Milhoan's point, greed plays a role in our society, unfortunately.
It's been years in formation. But everything we've talked about today, the most interesting thing to me is that it's global. We could be having the same discussion in Germany, in France, in South Africa, in England. None of this is uniquely American. A global syndicate appears to be running the table on this. Now, it includes a lot of powerful non-governmental agencies that are not elected. The United Nations, the WHO, the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, Gavi, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, formed by Gates and WEF, Unitaid, all the regulatory agencies are involved. Dr. Fauci was just here testifying. He is very prominent and active in the WHO. He is in no way retired. Jeremy Farrar, who is at the Wellcome Trust, who is in on these conversations with Fauci and Collins to try to cover up the lab origins of the virus, he's been rewarded for his work. He's now the chief scientist at the WHO. We have about 90% of our FDA commissioners take wonderful, lucrative jobs in industry after they finish regulating those individuals. You saw Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner, now on the board of Pfizer, on CNBC every day. Guess what? Promoting the Pfizer vaccine. Now it's in the open. Now we have FDA Commissioner Califf and one of the division directors, Marks, openly promoting the COVID-19 vaccines off-label. They're promoting the vaccines for things they actually don't do. They're promoting the vaccines to reduce hospitalization and death. Not a single prospective double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial ever showed the vaccines reduced hospitalization and death.
There's a carrot and a stick. The carrot is if you get enough of your panel vaccinated, you get a bonus. If you don't get the bonus. That's all throughout. When that came out, I'd never heard about that as a pediatrician before. I told people that doesn't occur. There's no way that happens. Pediatricians don't do this. Then I heard that if they had enough, they got a $40,000 bonus. What? And then if you speak out and you don't do it and you don't know because of the electronic medical record, they know everything that's going on, and you have the green light or the red light and all these kinds of things. Everyone knows that the practice governors know what's going on. And so if there are incentives that are even beyond the doctor to doctor, but into corporate medicine, that's a pretty big carrot. But there's also a stick. is that if you speak out about this, if you venture to say, I don't, this, I mean, whenever in medicine was I told what I could say what should be exempted? You can only exempt this vaccine for this. No, I've exempted so many kids for vaccine. Oh, you had a bad reaction to that? Okay, I'm never going to give that to you. This is basic. Never in our history were doctors limited on what we could exempt if we said, this is bad for our patient. You can't say that. And if you say it, you're gone.
There are over 9,000 messenger RNA patents. 9,000. Most of the prominent people who have a claim to invent messenger RNA are in Europe, and they work for these big companies. But let me tell you, the big patent holders are Sanofi, CureVac, Moderna, number 4, the US government. The US government is knee-deep in messenger RNA. In 2012, DARPA, our research unit of the military, declared a program. It's called the ADEPT P3 program. It said, we will end pandemics that could affect our military within 60 days using messenger RNA. That's in 2012. Messenger RNA didn't come out of Operation Warp Speed. This has been in the background.
Speaking of playing God, I got to listen to Dr. Fauci earlier this week. And yeah, well said. I want to bring up before the hearing today, just some of what he talked about in the deposition we had with him. He wrote a paper back in 2012 where he described a scenario, and he was talking about gain of function, changing, and I'm not a doctor, so if I screw this up, but we're changing viruses, and he wanted to get ahead of nature. That's what he was talking about, getting ahead of nature, because he was saying that nature creates viruses, and we have to get ahead of nature, and we have to create vaccines to fight the viruses that nature creates. Speaking of playing God. In gain of function, he was talking about gain of function research allows these scientists to be able to do that. Therefore, it's so necessary and important with the gain of function to create these viruses in a lab and then work on vaccines to combat the viruses. But then in this paper, he described a scenario where, worst case scenario, the virus escapes the lab and our worst nightmares come true. He also states in this paper that the benefits outweigh the risk. Those are Dr. Fauci's words. The benefits outweigh the risk. And this was back in 2012, and we saw the exact description of what he was talking about literally come true, happened to all of us and happened to the entire world. And in the questioning earlier this week with Dr. Fauci, he was asked if there's anything that you could do or change, or what would you like to, anything to make all of this better. He said the one thing he would like to do he wanted to see a stronger WHO or stronger UN, stronger world governing body over these labs to make sure that they're all compliant and make sure that they're all operating under the same rule. And then Dr. McCullough, you just mentioned that Dr. Fauci is working and serving with the WHO. Well, no wonder. This is a man, I want you all to really think about this. This is a man who for years and years and years, with his government position and government funded paycheck, was allowed to play God basically unchecked. And now it's no wonder that he wants to see a stronger WHO and a world governing body that would force medical compliance on all of Americans. So, Senator Johnson, I totally agree with what you said. This is something that we have to get ahead of.
There's a paper published by Farkas and colleagues in the journal Military Medicine, and it analyzed SARS-CoV-2 according to the criteria of a bioweapon. And there are dozens of criteria, and they check the box on, does the virus have these capabilities? The answer from the Farkas analysis, SARS-CoV-2 is a bioweapon. Now, there are two papers in the preprint literature by Dr. Xing Ling, who also a Chinese investigator now in the United States, who's also concluded it's a bioweapon.
I will take the heat for this one because I was the first pathologist in the world to bring up this point. After these shots rolled out, I started seeing an increase in the laboratory of certain types of cancer. You know, I at that point misstated the percentage, and then it normalized, but it was still 2 to 3-fold above what I was seeing in certain types of cancer: endometrial cancers, melanomas in young patients, very aggressive melanomas in young patients, confirmed by my colleague Dr. Anglish Dalgleish, one of the leading cancer researchers in the UK, confirmed by oncologists all around the world. There was a paper that came out from Singapore from a pharmaceutical individual. Every cancer drug off patent, look at this, the dose sales percentage increase in Singapore, where you can get the base level data. All of them are up anywhere from 20 to 30%, and this is purchase per dose. And they were one of the most highly boosted nations in the world. If you look at Ed Dowd's data, if you go to financetechnologies.com, he has the data set from the UK. Again, that healthy age 15 to 44 age group. 10 years of data, and then in 2021, huge spike. In 2022, even a bigger spike. The data don't lie.
You understand something changed. Right? What you bring up is people have noticed something changed because they know, I've never heard of so many people who were in complete remission, and now they suddenly appear back at their doctor in stage 4. Wait a minute, you've been in remission for 10 years and suddenly you're in stage 4. This is a repeating story that all the non-clinicians hear. I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I don't do the cancers, but I'm hearing these things. And this is what I'll hear from the doctors. I can't believe how many of these cancers I'm seeing, but it couldn't be from the vaccine. It's the only thing that's changed. Okay? So some of what we're fighting with in some of this is, you hear us, we're asking for the data. We're not just trying to make things without claims. We have enough of a signal. We want the whole data set. Yeah, so I'll tell you sort of the first case I saw. I was called down to the ER to see this kid because he had a slow heart rate, and he was this incredibly muscular, studly Texas player or Texas football player. And I walk in there, and often what happens when a pediatric cardiologist walks into the ER is everybody leaves the room. Oh, good, cardiology's here. They just all leave, right? But I walk in, and this kid's got a heart rate of 25. I'm thinking, I wouldn't have left the room. Yeah. Story was, second vaccine, next day at sports, he's not feeling so good. They take him in, they hook him up. He's got a heart rate of 20. He had really no risk from COVID at all. Most of these kids, most of these healthy kids, most of them never even knew they had COVID. When we were rolling this out, the CDC believed that 85% of children had already had COVID. We know natural immunity is very profound, if preventing COVID, but also keeping the symptoms very low if you get a new variant. But we see it. I will tell you, some of the good news is even though the regulatory bodies have not told the parents know. And so the parents who are willing to go down this road are decreasing. The mandates have come off. So as that has happened, I've watched the acute cases of myocarditis drop off.
Is that normal? Like, the media is going to say, oh, but this has always been the case. Myocarditis has been normal.
No, myocarditis, in a paper from Finland in 2018 published in Circulation by Aurelio and colleagues, established this, that we're talking about in the United States. There are numbers of cases per million. We are talking about a couple hundred cases in the United States per year. Giant cell myocarditis, Coxsackie adenovirus. I'm telling you, peer-reviewed literature now. We have tens of thousands of cases. This is not like, oh, and COVID itself does not cause myocarditis. This has been one of the biggest false narratives that have existed. So let me just be clear. 2.5% risk per shot. Half of them have no symptoms. That's now in the peer-reviewed medical literature. The concern is if there's a little bit of scarring that occurs, it can be the site of an abnormal heart rhythm that can suddenly land a young person in cardiac arrest on the playing field or at sleep. And a paper by Catagiani and colleagues from Brazil hypothesized that it's the surge of adrenaline that occurs during sports or during the waking hours of sleep, 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., that triggers these cardiac arrests.
But the one that Dr. McCullough is bringing up is that 50% had abnormal cardiac MRIs. I cannot assess your child's risk for sports participation if they've had symptoms of myocarditis following the vaccine without a cardiac MRI. I just can't do it because all the other tests I would normally use to reassure myself, including stress test, are shown to be normal. So that's this potential silent killer that's out there, but no one really wants to look into it because it's thousands of dollars to get a cardiac MRI.
The findings were 100% of people who took the vaccine, the cardiac PET scans turned abnormal. That instead of the heart using free fatty acids as its energetic fuel, it shifted to a preference in using glucose. And this was a distinctly abnormal pattern. As a cardiologist, I use cardiac PET to see if there's a lack of blood flow to an area, what's called ischemia. And that typically shows the heart muscle changes and actually prefers glucose. That's called a PET abnormality, an ischemic abnormality. What I'm telling you is people who take the vaccine to varying degrees, the hearts are not normal. And we can't completely characterize it.
Okay, that's a needle going into the arm. That's a blood vessel next to that needle. Next, this is from the late, great Dr. Burkhart. That's a ruptured vessel. Now those lipid nanoparticles can go everywhere. Next, that's spike protein in the muscles of the arm being expressed, all those little brown dots.
Wait, can you describe a little bit more?
Yeah, so
I'm not a doctor.
Yeah, so we make a special antibody in the lab that will bind to the spike protein, and then we put a little tail on it that makes it glow, and then anywhere it binds to, it glows. And in this case, we use a little dye that makes it show brown. So we know every one of those cells is expressing spike protein. So it was injected, the gene turned on, made spike protein attached to the surface of those cells. So that part was doing what it was supposed to do. However, we will see as we go on here. Next, the lipid nanoparticles we talked about, their harms next. This is the lipid nanoparticles accumulating. This is a Japanese study accumulating in the blood plasma, the whole blood, bone marrow, and see where that curve is going up? That's the lipid nanoparticles accumulating in the ovaries. Notice they cut that study off after 2 days. It was still accumulating. It was still going up. You'd never stop a study when it's still going up. Same in the bone marrow there. Next. These are all the chemicals that are in the lipid nanoparticles, not for human or veterinary use, went into billions of people. Next. This is the study that Dr. McCullough mentioned. This is the Rolkin study out of Stanford showing that the synthetic mRNA was still persistent 60 days later and still making spike protein. Next.
Wait.
Go back.
Can you go back? So how are we seeing it's still there? Can you describe
Yeah,
that
so on the left, you can see the pinkish color in each of those slides magnified 400 times. And you can see day 7, 16, 37, 42, and 60. Now, this wasn't every patient in the study that was still making it, but a significant percentage of patients were still making, still had the persistent synthetic RNA 60 days later. And on the right, you can see the little brown dots.
And that's the spike.
That's the spike being made 60 days later in these patients after these synthetic injections. Okay, next, this is a study from Dr. Brogna that Dr. McCullough mentioned where we know that the vaccinal spike is circulating 6 months later in 50% of patients. Next. Okay, so that spike protein lining a small blood vessel in the body, every brown dot. This is after injection. And like I said, it goes through circulation first. That initiates these clotting processes. Next.
So how is that directly after a vaccine?
That's within a few days after. Well, this patient was an autopsy series patient from Dr. Burkhart, and this patient died a couple months later and still was expressing spike protein in these tissues months after their last injection. One of the patients up to 123 days after death was still making spike protein in multiple organs in the body. Next. And here you can see a normal blood vessel on the left. Here you can see the immune system just collapsing and attacking that vessel on the right.
Wait, no, I can't see anything but dots. So help me.
Okay. All the red are red blood cells. All the blue are your white blood cells, your lymphocytes, your neutrophils, your eosinophils, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Okay, so.
That's the tube.
Okay, thank you.
This is what was the tube.
And it's all filled with inflammation and destroid.
All the purple dots are inflammatory cells.
Yeah, all the purple dots are inflammation there. The nucleus of cells.
And what kind of symptoms is this person
Well,
having
that one,
I mean, that looks like a mess.
yeah, that one's
So what do you
death.
feel?
Yeah, death, unfortunately, in that
That
patient.
patient died. Most of the people in the Burkharts, they died of myocarditis, thrombotic complications, just these medical disasters, a few days, weeks, or a few months after the shots.
After being
Yeah.
vaccinated.
So when it causes a vasculitis, that means that all your blood vessels are inflamed. So it's not just in the arm. When people feel this horrible sensation, like they say they feel like they're going to die after being vaccinated, I've never felt so horrible in all my life. That is a sense of they have a whole body inflammation. And because it goes wherever the blood vessels are, and it affects the blood the interior cells called endothelial cells of the blood vessels. It goes everywhere.
And this is the problem of injecting a gene with no off switch. And in some people, they may have gotten that almost placebo-like batch, and other people got a lot of the gene and DNA contamination and whatnot. There is no regulatory mechanism. We don't know who's a spike factory and who's not, who's making a lot of these atypical foreign proteins, who's not. This is why it didn't happen to everybody, thankfully. But there's still so many millions of people around the world that have been harmed. And these are just some of the mechanisms.
People just don't die for unknown reasons. Since the mass vaccination campaign has come on, we are inundated with report after report after report of just deaths with no cause. Our data suggests that, in fact, the vaccine is the cause of death.
And I can show that real quick. Just a picture's worth 1,000 words. So I'm gonna fly. This is that atypical amyloid protein in a heart blood vessel. That little blob in the middle. Yeah, the body doesn't break that down. Cardiac death. Yes. Next. Large vessel destruction. Next. This is the aorta, the biggest vessel in your body coming off your heart. On the right, that's the gross picture of the aorta, that big brown line in the middle. That's where the wall of it has been blown apart. And that's because all these fibers up at the purple on the left are being pushed apart by inflammation. If we go to the next picture, please. Every brown dot in the wall of this aorta, that's cells that have spike protein in them. And then that's a foreign protein being made by these cells. And then the immune cells, your killer T cells, come in, and your macrophages, they start destroying the tissue. And then that aorta blows apart and you die instantly.
So if this person had not been vaccinated, we would see none of these spike protein cells,
would not.
correct?
So obvious.
Yeah.
It's being so ignored.
It's blatantly obvious to the most casual observer.
So
And you don't have to be a pathologist to look at this and go, gosh, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. This is Sesame Street. This is brown dots that are death.
in a basic situation, we know this is a horrible protein. We know this virus is not that serious. And we're asking our body, our public health strategy right now is asking our body to make a toxic chemical, a cardiac toxin that goes all throughout our body.
Mhm.
That's our strategy right now. And we're going, guys, it's not working.
Thank you so much for being here. And again, I hope everyone shares this video. I appreciate the information. And again, a picture that you showed us today is worth 1,000 words. Bad stuff. Glad I didn't take the vaccine, but I'm also concerned for those that did. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It really was excellent.